B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, August 21st, 2019. Your humble host just returned from almost a week on the East Coast, spending time with friends and family in New York City. And it was a very nice visit. Nice to get away, enjoy a last gasp of summer. But it certainly was discouraging, dispiriting, and downright depressing to see Donald Trump sink to new lows with the ugly, scurrilous, obscene tweets that he made encouraging Benjamin Netanyahu to deny entry to Israel and the West Bank for Congresswoman Omar and Tlaib. It is truly a new low for an American president to give advice to a foreign nation that denigrates an elected official in the United States, including a woman who serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. And the Netanyahu government yielded to Trump's advice, his demand. And this is a moment that really is so ugly that it's hard to find adequate words to describe it. And that was almost a week ago, and now Trump is continuing this divisive, racist smear campaign. And his goal is to divide Americans, including the Jewish community. And as I've said before, unfortunately, the Democrats have enabled these points of attack by disciplining and trying to separate themselves from the positions on BDS, on the politics of the extreme right-wing government of Netanyahu. And Trump has just lowered the boom. Now, he is emboldened because his poll numbers have been stable and in some cases increasing. And he knows that he doesn't face impeachment. And have you noticed that since the congressional break began, that impeachment is way, way off the radar right now? And if it makes a comeback, it's going to take an outcry from the American public when Congress reconvenes after Labor Day. Now, the latest effort by Trump, which he denies is anti-Semitic, is just that. He's using the kind of so-called trope that Democrats demonized their own party members over by asserting that Jews should have dual loyalties and that people who are American citizens of Jewish faith or culture, identity, are disloyal, apparently to Israel, he's clarified that, if they vote for Democrats. Now, on the plane last night, as I was flying back to San Francisco, I dove into David Talbot's very important book. It's called The Devil's Chessboard, and I have read through the sections of the early years of the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and his brother Allen Dulles, who had been a very influential intelligence officer during World War II and climbed over some other bodies to become head of the CIA in 1952. And this occurred as Joseph McCarthy was in the ascendance, and Dick Nixon, who'd been elected to Congress from California, collaborated with the Dulles brothers, with the far right-wing corporate interests, and they allowed McCarthy to do a lot of damage until he went too far. And going too far was to investigate the CIA for un-American activities, communists, and fellow travelers, as they were called at the time. And McCarthy used unhinged smears on a regular basis. Many people were blacklisted, their lives were ruined, and they were smeared because McCarthy claimed that they had been un-American. And Trump's antics in the past week are so McCarthy-esque. It is stunning and chilling all at the same time. And the connector there is Roy Cohn, who Trump views as a mentor and who was the legal counsel to the McCarthy House Un-American Activities Committee. And we all now know that Roy Cohn was gay. And that didn't stop him from accusing people who were targeted because of their political views or affiliations. And Roy Cohn was willing to smear them as gays, queers, homosexuals. And these are the kinds of tactics that are underway right now. And so, on the one hand, Trump wins support from some Jewish Americans because he has demonized Omar. He has denounced BDS. With a little help now from Bill Maher. Boy, was that ugly. And so we are truly descending into a really frightening period in American history. And Trump's motivation, I heard Rush Limbaugh verbally dancing on his show this morning because he loves seeing this divisive approach. And we're told it was Russia, that sows all this discord in America and makes us question, skeptical of each other. But this is a clear divide and conquer strategy. And then he gets help from people who join him and claim, like this quote here, there's a growing cancer within the Democratic Party of people who are supportive of BDS, who are advocating a shift in the U.S.-Israel relationship away from the strong bond that exists now between this administration and the government in Israel. Now, there were only 17 House members who voted against that recent resolution condemning BDS. 17 Democrats. I think it was 16 Democrats and 1 Republican, if I'm correct. And so the facts don't matter. These are emotional, race-based smears. And I'm afraid they are working. A recent poll shows that in New York State, 57% of Jews show approval for Trump. Now, that's higher than any other group, whites, Catholics, Protestants. Likewise, a majority of New York's Jews say they plan to vote for Trump. And I've seen people who post on Facebook, just average Joes, who take one piece of Trump's demagoguery and say, well, it makes a little sense to me. Usually it's the attacks on Omar, Tlaib, and the other members of the so-called squad. So then we get this clown, Wayne Allen Root, a conservative talk radio host, who doesn't even understand the fundamentals of the Jewish faith. But that didn't stop him from tweeting that Trump, this was on his radio show, Trump is the greatest president for Jews and for Israel in the history of the world. And Trump approvingly retweeted, or I guess he tweeted quotes of Root, saying that Israelis love the U.S. president like he's the king of Israel. But, of course, he went on to say they love him like he is the second coming of God. And polite newspaper reports note, Jews do not believe in a second coming. So these comments from Trump are clearly what qualifies as an anti-Semitic trope. And had they been uttered by a Democrat, especially a Muslim American Democrat, and specifically a Muslim American Democratic member of Congress, there would be an uproar, and the right wing would just be out of control. So the double standard that's being applied here is something that has been enabled by the Democrats, and Trump has just driven huge piles into it. My fear is that it works. Democrats are now intimidated, afraid, just as they were of Joe McCarthy in 1953. And so Trump continues in his very divisive approach to trying to win the election next year at all costs. And then there's this weird fantasy about buying Greenland. And now Trump is all upset and hurt, and his feelings have been damaged and bruised because Denmark, which controls Greenland through an autonomous agreement that was reached in 1979, has said, well, the idea that the United States would buy Greenland is absurd. But Trump thinks that word absurd is nasty. And he dinged the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen. It's not a nice way of doing it. She could have just said, no, we'd rather not do it. She's not talking to me. She's talking to the United States of America. They can't say, how absurd. And so, Trump, you may think you're the king of Israel, but you're not the king of Greenland, and you're not the king of the United States. And I'm about to report to you on a series of moves, many of which are completely illegal today, and some of which are flatly unconstitutional. For example, Trump is back on a rant that he started a couple of years ago, that he wants to end birthright citizenship. And I know some people who don't like the idea that just because you're born in the United States, you're automatically a citizen. And it's no doubt that some people have come to the United States to have a baby knowing that it would have automatic citizenship. Problem is, it is embedded in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And maybe the King of Israel thinks that he can simply wave his scepter, and that will change. Now, in addition, they unveiled a new regulation today to allow the detention indefinitely of migrant families who cross the border illegally. They want to blow up the Flores settlement. And once again, this is a separation of powers issue where the administration does not have the authority to arbitrarily change the rules regarding the limits on detention of children who are in the United States without documents. So they've published the rule in the Federal Register. It'll take effect in 60 days, but court challenges will probably delay that. That's not all, because top immigration officials are trying to sort through a ruling that came from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco last Friday. And I don't understand this. I'm confused myself. I need to read up a little more on it. But the Ninth Circuit ruled on matters outside of its geographical jurisdiction because the Ninth Circuit covers California and Arizona. And in the decision that was announced, they are saying that the new asylum rules can go into effect in New Mexico and Texas. And I'm at a loss for words here. I cannot rationally explain that. So it caused a few problems for the folks at ICE. They sent a memo to asylum officers last Saturday, and they had to correct themselves with an update 3 days later. And what this shows fundamentally is that the Trump administration just throws shit at the wall to see what will stick. And just like they nominate people and then let them withdraw because, whoops, we really didn't look into your background, they announce policies that may feel good to Stephen Miller and to Donald Trump and to the right-wing nuts who fund their anti-immigrant policies. Here's another one. They plan to issue a new policy that would deny work permits to asylum seekers who cross the border without authorization, as well as those who are convicted of a felony. And this follows the move to deny permanent residency to immigrants who use or, quote, are likely to use public benefits like food stamps. Now, what does likely to use mean? You either do or you don't. And I don't support penalizing people who use social services, but there are certainly plenty of Americans who think that that is a reasonable or justifiable move. This new work permit policy, which has not been previously reported, is expected to be included in a forthcoming regulation that would allow only those who applied for asylum at a port of entry to be eligible for a work permit. So what we have here is a dizzying array of regulations that are changing on an almost daily basis, creating confusion, and the whole desired outcome by Trump and his allies is that it will send this message, don't come to the United States. And I think they misread it, as they have from the start, that this actually causes people to say, I think we better get there before it's completely impossible. And, of course, it also just is in denial of the conditions that cause people to head for the United States. And I want to recommend Kevin Gostola's lead story at Shadowproof today. They've been around for 4 years, by the way, and I tip my hat to Kevin's work. He writes about the class action suit that has been launched to try to improve the conditions in the detention facilities, the jails where immigrants are held. There are systemic problems of denial of medical care, failure to provide mental health treatment, lack of accommodation for persons with disabilities. And we know that there are atrocious conditions in these detention centers. Many of them are operated for profit by corporations. And the lives of the people who are in their charge don't matter. They are disposable. That is the ethos that is operative in the immigration jails. And I've heard them referred to as detainment centers. I don't think detainment is a word, but I haven't looked it up. I think it is mangled English. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like John Morgan, Judy Holloway, Ben Brotman, and Patrick Garay. I do appreciate your support. It keeps me going and helps pay the bills here for the servers and the phone bills and all the computers and all that stuff. So if you'd like to join them, I'd like you to. Visit peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. You pull on it, land on Become a Subscriber. The sign-up page is easy. You choose $5, $10, $20 a month, or our $50 annual subscription, which earns you the bonus book of your choice. I currently offer 2100, the dystopian utopia. That's the blueprint for survival from climate change. And I've got a copy or two of Dr. Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch. So grab a new annual subscription and be happy to share one of those books with you. Now, we are, I believe, facing a recession. I believe that part of it is just the market cycle. But I also believe that Trump has revved up the economy in a way that has pulled out cash, increased debt, trillion-dollar deficit looming again next year. And so he's trying to spin his way out of it or out of responsibility for it. One of the lines of attack is that Democrats want a recession, even though it'll hurt members of their party and its base, because it's a way to get Trump out of office. And so feverishly, the spin continues as Trump in his con man pitch says, everything's great, we just want to make it greater. And he's leaning on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates by a full percentage point. Now, they're as low as they can go. There's no incentive to save. And Trump is basically just running the economy at full tilt. He's talked about a payroll tax cut, and then he said no. He's talking about some administrative move that effectively would reduce capital gains taxes. So he's looking for ways to stimulate an overheated economy where the fundamentals are out of whack and the debt load is extremely high. And I do not buy the notion that anybody is wishing for a recession. But that does become a very clear measure of the failure of his policies if we do fall into a recession, which is defined as 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. Meanwhile, I'm not sure exactly how to characterize this. A report from The Guardian headline, Police thwarted 6 mass shootings and white supremacist attacks since El Paso. Now, we always have to suspect that there's an FBI paid informant behind these cases, and the idea that 6 of them have popped suggests that, they've got these things lined up and ready to go public with when they need to change the subject and show that law enforcement is on the case. And out of these 6 cases, at least 4 appear to involve men espousing far-right views and racist ideologies, including targeting Jews, LGBTQ persons, and, of course, brown people, mostly Hispanics. So we've got a case August 8th in Las Vegas. A 23-year-old man wanted to attack Jews in a gay bar, was trying to build a bomb. He was charged with possession of illegal firearms and destructive devices. During encrypted conversations online, that suggests a paid informant who was onto him, he would regularly use racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-gay slurs. In Connecticut, August 15, Brandon Wagshall, age 22, taken into custody after he wrote on Facebook he was interested in committing a mass shooting. He wanted to build his own rifle. He was charged with illegal possession of large-capacity ammunition magazines. Daytona Beach, Florida, 16th of August, 25-year-old man arrested after he sent violent, threatening text messages to an ex-girlfriend saying he wanted to commit a mass shooting. Only problem? He didn't own firearms. Then New Middletown, Ohio, on the 17th of August, a 20-year-old James Reardon threatened to commit a shooting at a local Jewish community center. Now, how can somebody declare Trump to be king of the Jews when Jewish people are among those who are prime targets of the right-wing white nationalist nuts who often cite him as their inspiration? Here's one from Florida. Do I have that right? Nope, sorry. Looks like, he's from Maryland, but he was in the Miami area. And he said, I thank God every day Donald John Trump is president, saying that he expected Trump to launch a racist war. Well, he may be onto something. As you know, I'm a skeptic of the Russiagate narrative. I haven't seen any substantial proof that Russia meddled in the 2016 election in a way that affected the outcome. And while I've told you that I believe the portion of the Mueller report that presents the case for obstruction of justice, Mueller did a lot of damage in his report and in his bizarre testimony before Congress by claiming this widespread and systemic Russian effort to undermine and affect our elections. Now, one of the claims that came from Mueller and was reinforced by the Senate Intelligence Committee report in July is that all 50 states were targeted by Russia, that Russian agents combed the websites of state election agencies. And Gareth Porter, a man I deeply respect, he's a historian and journalist, publishing at the American Conservative, there's a link to it in the show file for this podcast, debunks it. He opens the bombshell Senate Intelligence Committee report repeated the familiar claim that Russia targeted the electoral websites of at least 21 states. It turns out the reality is dramatically different from the headlines. The states' own responses show that with one exception, they found either no effort to penetrate any of their election-related sites or merely found scanning and probing associated with an IP address. Mueller claimed that Russians used that IP address to hack into Illinois state election systems, a specific one, and access some 200,000 voter records. Mueller provided no additional evidence, nor was there any evidence that any data was tampered with. But when you dig into it, quoting Porter here, the overarching reality is that there was no real penetration anywhere else. As for outside probing and testing of vulnerabilities, that's something that states contend with every day. For example, Oregon's chief information officer says that the state blocks upwards of 14 million attempts to access our network every day. Wow. Those Russians are really busy. Colorado's Secretary of State told the Washington Post the kind of scanning discussed by the Department of Homeland Security happens hundreds, if not thousands of times per day. And in late September of 2016, the aim of the hackers in the Illinois case was possibly for the purpose of selling personal information, since they had stolen the data but made no effort to alter it online. And one of the claims of Russian hacking is based on the fact that 6 of 8 servers were traced to a young Russian living in Siberia. That is not the same as the GRU. Also, DHS admitted that the only thing targeted ahead of the 2016 election had been the Phoenix Public Library, not the state of Arizona's election sites. So there's a lot of truth in this, and it doesn't square with what Americans have been told. But that doesn't stop them from believing bullshit. Because a new poll just released by the Morning Consult and Politico shows that overall 61% of Americans now believe that Russia will try to interfere in the 2020 election. That's an increase of 14%. And what's stunning is that 44% of Republicans now believe Russia will try to interfere in 2020. That is a 19% increase since last October. And Democrats are already hopeless. They were at 70% believing Russia will hack in 2020, and that's now at 78%. We are living in a world of propaganda. And far too many people believe it. Now, here's another issue related to polling. You know that the next Democratic debates coming up in September require the candidate to have placed at 2% or higher in 4 separate approved polls. And Michael Tracy at Real Clear Politics, there's a link to this article in the show file of the podcast, notes that Tulsi Gabbard so far has not been invited to the debate, even though she's ahead of several candidates who've already been granted early entry, including Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, and Andrew Yang. Now, the overall Real Clear Politics average shows Gabbard at 3.3% support. But the polls that they use are not approved by the DNC. So, for example, Gabbard is doing very well, or at least better than others, in New Hampshire, where she places at 3% or higher. But that is not an approved poll. Neither is the one in South Carolina, where she has the 2% that she needs. So she has polled at 2% or more in 2 polls that are officially approved. And she has surpassed the donor minimum required. She's at 160,000. So this is an important piece because I guess Tulsi Gabbard is getting the Bernie Sanders treatment by the DNC, at least the 2016 version. I've also taken the DNC to task for its refusal to hold a presidential debate focused on climate change. And CNN is holding one in September. It's not sanctioned by the DNC. And Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, had been brushed back by the DNC and told if he participated in an unsanctioned debate, he wouldn't be invited to any of the sanctioned debates. But the CNN debate does not include Jim Steyer, the San Francisco billionaire who is all about climate change, or Jay Inslee, who has centered his campaign on climate change. And to her credit, Naomi Klein airs this out in an article today at The Intercept. Political turmoil in Italy this week as the Premier Giuseppe Conte resigned, blaming the collapse of his 14-month-old populist government on his right-wing nationalist Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, who has been grandstanding by refusing to allow rescue ships of migrants who were picked up off the Mediterranean into Italy. So Conte blasted Salvini for setting in motion a dizzying spiral of political and financial instability by pulling the plug on the government. And, of course, Matteo Salvini hopes that he is going to be the next prime minister of Italy, riding a wave of immigrant bashing and nationalism. You've seen the pictures. It's very impressive. Again, over this weekend, over 1 million people, I heard as a number as high as 1.7 million, took to the streets of Hong Kong. And part of me looks at that and says, what's wrong with Americans? Why are we not marching in the streets and demanding the resignation or the impeachment of Donald Trump? But I want you to examine a piece written at the Gray Zone Report today, Gray Zone Project, under the byline of Dan Cohen, because he raises good questions about the connection of many of the protest leaders to U.S. politicians, to the U.S. Endowment for Democracy, Marco Rubio. There is a wealthy man. He is a tycoon named Jimmy Lai, L-A-I, and he appears to be funding a lot of the protests. He could be a conduit for American money, and I don't have proof. But I think that the skepticism and suspicions are well-founded. And again, as I'm reading David Talbot's book, it's easy to imagine the U.S. once again meddling in another country's affairs. And finally today, just a few quick statistics. Trump has once again flipped. This was predictable. He made noises about supporting legislation for mandatory background checks after the recent round of mass killings. But one call from Wayne LaPierre at the NRA, and that's behind us, just like yesterday's comb-over. And so, once again, I think there will be pressure on Congress to do something, and they will find a way to increase the powers of law enforcement without really changing our scheme of gun regulation. And as I've told you hundreds of times, I support all rational regulation of guns in this country. I don't think the Second Amendment is nearly as expansive as its supporters say. But here are sobering statistics. Alameda County is across the bay from me. The county seat is Oakland. And when you look at the 862 cases of crimes where a firearm was used in Alameda County in 2018, fully half of those weapons were not registered in California. And only 7.6% were registered to the individual who was arrested for the crime. Now, I don't say this to suggest that we should make no moves to add regulations to guns. But we have to recognize the deep gun culture in this country and the hundreds of millions of weapons that are already out there. And I'm loath to quote a trope from the NRA, but when guns are outlawed, the outlaws will continue to have them. And that is the conundrum we face. I welcome any advice or comments you have, but it's hard to see us really coming to terms with this incredible, deadly problem that we have. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with everyone. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails